Well, thank you, Andy. So my name is Brett Hofer. I actually am the managing architect and lead the Enterprise Solution Architect team, where we do some of the largest rollouts for Dynatrace in the enterprise. And when I say the largest rollouts, we're typically solutioning and designing for upwards of 10,000 to 50,000 and up host units throughout the enterprise. My background in this prior to Dynatrace, and actually, Andy, I think we have a podcast on my background. It's podcast 71, where I spent a lot of time doing a lot of work with large-scale enterprise as one of the senior app managers of a very, very large system. So it's a privilege for me that Dynatrace giving me the opportunity to run this type of level leadership in designing solutions and working with our largest clients, as well as directly with our product management team in ensuring that we can maintain the performance and that we can continuously evolve the demands that such large-scale deployments require. So with that said, the premise of this, this is kind of, as we stated, it's an inside look at Dynatrace being rolled out and some of the mechanisms and some of the things that we run into in massive rollouts. And one of the biggest things I really talk about is that it requires exceptional leadership. Essentially, in these type of deployments, we're looking for a lot of top-down support throughout the organization to make an initiative this successful. Along with that is developing these designs and the ability to put together an entire architecture that you know will work. And then being able to have everything that leadership and the designs that we come up with properly communicated, not only amongst the actual team that's ready to deploy throughout the organization, but also planning that and communicating it out to a lot of the onboarding applications throughout the enterprise. One of the biggest comments that I'll make on this is the fact that in large-scale enterprises, the teams that are responsible for rolling out are usually dealing with, thousands or hundreds of application teams throughout the organization. So scale is massive. The design is massive. So with that said, we have an enterprise director who actually really, put the light bulb on when stating when you start rolling out monitoring to tens of thousands of hosts throughout a major enterprise digital ecosystem, that we're not really longer a software with a couple dashboards on a NOC. In these type of scenarios, in these deployments, the entire digital health of the enterprise becomes reliant on the data and the AI of Dynatrace. Therefore, really what we're looking at is the integrity of the data and the processes and the availability of Dynatrace are elevated to tier 1 expectations. Basically, we're looking at the fact that the team that has to roll out such a large, massive rollout takes on a lot of responsibility and a tremendous amount of takes a lot of leadership to drive that forward, and a lot of trust in the design patterns that are put in place to support Dynatrace at this size. And, in many of the cases, not all, but many of the cases where we deal with managed, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, they have their own sets of challenges because obviously the companies that we work with really have to manage the hardware themselves, scale the hardware themselves, and understand it. When it comes to SaaS, in the SaaS environments, obviously with our architects really managing the cloud architectures, we're in demand of the uptime, but there's still a lot of the regular other processes that have to be in place and available, especially looking at traffic patterns and sizes. So what I used to typically say is that the bigger the rollout, the bigger the challenge, right? In many cases, this is no longer where you just sit down and say, well, we've got 40,000 hosts and they're in a bunch of locations. Let's just go ahead and just deploy this. And it's amazing how easy at Dynatrace we've actually made the one agent to do those deployments. But once those deployments are made, along with them, of course, comes a lot of traffic and traffic patterns, traffic flows, and traffic controls that just need to be properly planned early and in the beginning. And the fact is that we're always dealing with extremely large numbers when we do this. So what are some of the considerations that happen when we say the bigger the rollout, the bigger the challenge? Well, first of all, we're managing higher expectations. There are a lot of higher expectations of the Dynatrace product itself, of the team, the demands on the team, meaning that there's going to be a lot of things coming at them regarding requests, training, how do they get their information, how do they get their reports, and the uptime. We find that during this, that improper planning actually can really kill, meaning that if you do not have a lot of the inputs of the application teams, or you've not properly worked with the infrastructure teams throughout the organization, when you're moving that much information about the systems throughout, there's a lot of different planning that needs to happen. Things like security and ports and traffic sizes and where the data is going to end up going to. But improper planning kills, but proper planning makes this incredibly efficient. And this is one of the big things that you always want to keep in mind when you start doing these very large rollouts. The next thing is more environments. So we're actually when you get the larger scale systems where you have a lot of considerations about various environments. So of course you have all these different applications and each one of them introduces new environments. And we're not talking about just dev and test and stage, but performance. We're also talking about things like mainframe environments, cloud environments, and so on, where you have completely different an ecosystem for monitoring. We have more applications, as I said, up to like thousands. The cluster sizes that we have to use in Dynatrace to manage such large amounts of data and users, the clusters actually start getting bigger. When I say bigger, I mean, we're no longer like in our prior days of one server, but we then span to 3 servers, then we get to 6 servers, then we get to 12 servers. We will eventually be getting to 15 and 18 server clusters. So when we talk about clusters large, these are 64 core clusters with 0.5 terabytes of RAM that can be upwards of 12, 15 nodes. These are what we consider big clusters in these type of environments. We have very complex hybrid cloud use cases in large deployments, meaning that the more machines that we're rolling out to, the more application teams we're rolling out to, the more IT that we're touching, we end up getting into the territories of applications that are doing major transformations. So eventually what we're seeing is applications that are being transformed traditionally and then being actually moved into more cloud native environments. And then still wanting to see the visibility of that application regardless of where it's actually deployed. And with proper design plans, that's exactly what we can accomplish with Dynatrace if done correctly. And that's where our team comes in. I say early mistakes lead to big problems. Well, certainly if you, in the design and the planning stages, if you start building things out and, you don't work through and do the proper due diligence during the design phase, you can set off things where, let's say you deploy out, and remember, in many of these large-scale environments, we're talking about deployments of up to like 8,000 can happen at a time. And if that happens and it's in a production environment and there are specific things that you rolled out with, and you didn't name certain things, or you just didn't have the right things set up, and you didn't plan correctly, it could lead to where you might have to go back and either reinstall those monitoring agents and or have to be restarted. And in production, that is obviously a much bigger abrasion to a lot of the teams. So that's what we really mean by early mistakes. And a lot of these mistakes can be completely avoided. But again, it all comes down to when these big, large scale things into proper planning with the right resources involved. We also notice a lot of challenging backup, DR, and high availability scenarios. And the larger the clusters get, the more challenged that we are as a solutioning team and as a product for managing that. Now, normally we are a cloud-based design with a lot of very good patterns for high availability. But what's interesting in a lot of the cases where we run into are on-prem deployments where people have customers may have 1-2 data centers, and they're trying to manage their availability throughout that. So we find a lot of these cases to become unique and challenging, and the product team has been doing a fantastic job at solutioning through ways to deal with these challenges. More locations. So we see a lot more locations. We see global. So we're seeing a lot more of things like not only just in the U.S., but regional cloud deployments. And let me just say for a second, is there any questions yet? Andy, I know I've been talking for a bit.
No, I mean, there are some questions, but I think we will keep them to later. That's a little too generic. So let's, and I hear you coughing. Maybe you want to get a glass of water or something like that as well. But
yeah, I just grabbed the water.
Yeah.
So another big thing that we have is
the only feedback, Brad. The only feedback that I keep getting is whether you're also going to show, and some of these questions go into a direction, whether you're going to show some examples later on, or can talk about examples on, proper planning. I think around tagging, management zones, and things like that. I think people are looking.
Yep, I will absolutely be touching on that.
Perfect.
Yep. So we also face tougher security. So we have different security zones that we hop through on these larger deployments. So what ends up happening is where the agents are placed versus where the security gates are placed, and then that they have to actually move the data through that type of security. Also security in the sense of privatization of information, depending on a lot of these clusters, how we store it. We face a lot of those through a lot of the large scale deployments. As I mentioned before, complex network traffic. Another big one is in these larger deployments, self-monitoring becomes key, meaning that self-monitoring of Dynatrace itself is very, very important to the overall enterprise, knowing what the health of the clusters are and as the things that are moving through. And then managing any or all of Dynatrace limits. And when we say limits, we mean like properly making sure that when you set up the clusters and network traffic is moving through these clusters, that it's been properly balanced, and that it's not being overloaded at all these at various stages, including the environment. And communication is definitely everything. And when I say communication, I mean anything and all decisions that are being made from the design or how things are rolled out, how the automation works, how the team should build dashboards, how they should use management zones, setting up whether it's the Confluence pages or a full site that really communicates out what the team is doing is really key to making this successful for these deployments. And then finally, experience standards and docs are key. And when I say experience and standards, exactly what you just mentioned, Andy, is really around, setting up the proper metadata and things that we end up doing in order to make sure that it is successful.
Hey, Brett, there's actually one question that came in and on when you talked about self-monitoring is key. Just a clarification, I believe. The question is, I assume that, Dynatrace is monitoring itself. Does it mean we need to set up additional monitoring to monitor Dynatrace, or what do you mean with this?
Yeah, so typically on the very large deployment cases, there is a SaaS environment that is set up where the actual clusters of these large clusters will end up reporting to. In fact, the cluster nodes will have their own one agents on them. But then as we deploy out to other, we deploy out other active gates throughout the enterprise in various locations, each one of those are also given a one agent. So we are actually monitoring our own infrastructure and including the use of Dynatrace itself, such as people running the dashboards and, all the different services that they use when they log in and what their experience is when they come into the cluster.
Okay, perfect. And I would assume, so that means, are we then sending that data? So if you're talking about the one agents on the active gates, would these one agents report to the same core Dynatrace cluster that they run on premise when they run managed? Would it be just a separate environment, or would it be a dedicated?
No, it would be, actually Dynatrace in these large scaled environments provides a SaaS environment that they will all report to. And in some cases, now typically we will have the agents report directly, but other times we'll actually, in some cases, we put active gates that our self-monitoring agents will report to, and then they run through a proxy up into that SaaS environment. But it's primarily a SaaS environment that our Dynatrace sets up.
Cool. Now, I want to throw a couple of other things in that Jerry just posted. I'm not sure if you covered this later on, but I want to throw it out so you can figure out if you want to answer it now or later. Best practices around onboarding and segmentation. There will be a question from him. And the other question is, other than Dynatrace One Premium, other support professional services options.
Yep. And I will touch on every single one of those.
Perfect.
So let me move forward. Actually, I'm going to move this. So one of the big things I'm going to talk about is when we talked about the extra services in DT1. One thing I want to talk about is what our team does that I run when we get into these large scale environments. So yes, DT1 Premium are tremendous services that we offer at Dynatrace for a lot of the everyday transactional assistance, expertise, and product specialists that work more transactionally. The teams that are maybe just heard of or not heard of as much is our teams, because these are typically at the very largest of scales that we get involved, is the Enterprise Solution Architecture team. And then we end up spending a lot of our time really more on a strategic level. And a lot of the seniority that we have of 8 to 20 years of experience leading and organizing these enterprise discussions. So I'm going to talk very briefly about what those look like, but this is exactly what happens during a lot of these large deployments. It's when the ESA team, as well as our colleague team called the EPM, or the Enterprise Program Management team, gets involved, who do more of the actual program management, the ESAs. will do a lot of the guidance and upfront design, and we actually build standard assets, and then we help direct these best practices as some of the things I'm going to use as examples that you asked about earlier, meaning, how do you set up the management zones? What are you doing for onboarding processes and things like that? That would be a lot of guidance that comes from our team.
Mm-hmm.
So really what we do is when we start one of these large deployments and we start talking about doing one of these massive efforts and looking at all the capacity, we actually hold an initial design session with one of the senior architects from my team, and we have an entire work strategy week where we actually will whiteboard with the architects in a large-scale enterprise and design out using all of the best practices that we have developed over the course of time building out these large deployments. And a lot of this is very collaborative, and it's extremely well structured. The agendas that we run through, it's very meticulous over the topics that we actually work through. Some of the large accounts that you may have heard us that are in, from Kroger to American Express to JP Morgan, and there's many others. These are just some examples of very large accounts. What we end up doing with the ESAs, just to give you an idea of the design and leadership that we do on a lot of these large deployments, we end up kicking off like a 40-hour week. And we do a kickoff, and then we go into a design evolution. We talk about the install, the setup, and the rollout planning. And these are typically on the new enterprise customers who've never done this before. And then we will continually throughout an entire annual contract maintain cadence weekly with the teams, ensuring that all the best practices are applied. And then we also share a lot of these design assets internally with our product management team, and we also are liaisons as enterprise architects to manage through a lot of these challenges. As far as existing customers are concerned, we do it's a bit similar, but there's less upfront work involved, because typically a lot of it's just a refactoring, or sometimes it's a redesign of what they have, or it's a check on what they have, and then a balance on refactoring some of the processes that are being done to actually do these deployments. So what are the assets that we typically use? And we talk about onboarding. Okay, so in the very initial stages of a massive deployment, kickoff agenda, we would have an architecture, and the kickoff agenda really outlines, and I have examples of all the different topics that we cover, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the best practices and things of those topics. After that, from that, we then develop an enterprise Dynatrace architecture document that is a very extensive document covering all of the decisions that are made in a variety of areas. There's actually 9 core areas that we cover as far as best practices for that. We also provide a series of architectural designs of what the managed environment, working with our large deployment customers. And then we always maintain a series of notes. And then finally, when we talk about, massive rollouts, we've developed a worksheet, or basically a workbook that actually leverages Power Query and allows us to plan out these major deployments, do massive sizing and network traffic capacity calculations. We're able to look at what you have rolled out, plan to roll out versus what you have already rolled out, so that it helps track the rollout process and the progress of that rollout. So some of the quick examples of the topics that we will typically cover more in here, and I'm going to talk about each one of these topics. Just do a time check here. So this example one that was done was actually done where they wanted just a drink from the fire hose with the architect team that's very familiar with telemetry and Dynatrace in general and is really wanting to move towards more of a Dynatrace platform. And then we move into day 3, which really just goes right down and we break down each topic where we have the whiteboarding sessions. We talk about sizing, capacity, HR, and DR. We begin talking about the best practices of host groups, process groups, services, management zones. And then we get into the setup and deployment and your automation schemes. And then as we go through that, all of the different security things like user management and LDAP connections, integrations. And then as we enter into day 4, we talk about dashboards, visualization, the user experience management, how we do alert profiling and integrations in that particular deployment. So this is a week-long engagement by a senior enterprise architect who has the knowledge of the best practices and a lot of familiarity with these large-scale deployments to help guide through. And then finally on day 5 is where, and again, this is really where we talked about deploying out these plans and proper planning and proper design. This is where we end up kicking everything off to get one of these going. So let's talk a little bit about, some of the, like we talked about as far as what we're providing when we end up going in here. So we do architectural strategy, setup and deployment, security and user management, alert problems, DevOps and lifecycle, dashboards and reporting. These are all the topics that we end up covering in the initial design and architectural week. And then we capture a lot of the upfront things out of the gate, and then this becomes a living document that is then shared amongst the entire team for the large deployment as we continue. And this is one of the communication mechanisms that we end up using. From an onboarding, so how do we get into onboarding? Well, this goes into, and again, this was developed by my team, which really follows a lot of the best practices in going through every different facet of planning on onboarding particular applications. Now, how does this typically work? Well, there's a couple ways that onboarding actually happens in these large deployments. One of which may be you have a very mature enterprise application portfolio or a CMDB, which can then essentially feed a massive list of hosts that you plan to roll out to. So in organizations that have these mature CMDBs, you can actually build and prioritize these massive hosts that you decide to deploy out to and then use them to drive the onboarding process. And when I say drive it, I mean plan it. Because the more information that we have in the planning stage, meaning like from a CMDB and we know the locations of where these hosts are. If you happen to have hosts in the cloud in various regions, if you have multiple data centers scattered throughout globally or within North America, we would capture, and we have best practices for assigning them what we call network zones, which you're going to actually see come out into Dynatrace in the very near future for more location awareness. But we have best practice patterns on how to get one agents to traffic to certain gates within certain locations. And in order to make those calculations of how many gates are needed, how many cluster nodes are needed, the more information that we can feed into this planning process, the better it is, the more accurate it is, and the better prepared we are. So some of the things that we're able to do with a lot of this stuff is once we've got the data loaded, of course, we can then start looking at how many hosts are being rolled out within a specific month, within a specific environment. We can track things like how many we've planned, how many have been deployed, how many are going into specific environments, how many were unplanned. So to answer whoever's question was about the onboarding process, this, from my team's perspective, because obviously everybody may have different ways on how they do it, but we feel we've put together one of the most comprehensive ways to piece all of this information together. On the right-hand side here actually is the expected traffic that we expect to see coming within from specific sites. And we have site code patterns that we use in order to ensure that we can roll up and look at what those traffic patterns are. So there's a lot of information that we capture within this sheet, and this sheet is this workbook, which is primarily Excel right now, has evolved over lots of time for and experience in planning out the whole onboarding process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Brett, I believe it was Jerry who was asking the question. He can let me know if this answers the onboarding part. There is another question from Benjamin that came in, and I think it fits from an onboarding and rollout perspective of Dynatrace. He's asking, in bigger installations with several environments and network zones, you may want to distribute a single generic one-agent package and point it to some environment, and during installation time, and at a later time, then point the one agent to the environment it should report to. So the question is it possible to roll out a generic one-agent installer, and then after the installation later on, point it to whatever active gate it needs to point to, in case you want to, once you know where the agent should send data to?
Yes, that's possible. Network zones is coming out very soon. It's actually active in the product right now. One agents aren't really directed per se to a specific active gate. What happens is, as you bring up certain active gates, and depending on the type of active gate that you're bringing up, it forms a hierarchical list for every one agent. And so we have design patterns that can leverage, let's say, a global traffic manager, where it can actually make the decision as to which gate to use. That's one pattern. And then obviously there's more detail on how that works. The second pattern is the ability that's coming out where you can specify what we call a network zone, and you tell the gate what network zone you're in, or what a network zone it's in. So for example, if you created a network zone in let's say AWS, the US East region, on a very specific area, you can give it a zone code. And then at that point, any one agent, you can go back and update the one agent and say, hey, here's your zone code. And as soon as you do that, and the agent is recycled for recognizing that that's where its location is, it will immediately prioritize only the gates in that network zone.
Cool. I think the question, because he just responded with a kind of another question, or let's say with a clarification. I think his point was also that the installation package of the one agent, if that is generic and not tied to a particular Dynatrace environment, and really during the installation of the one agent, taking this generic package, and during the installation then pointing the agent to a specific Dynatrace environment. I think it just makes one agent package handling easier from their perspective. So that would be much, if that's actually possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might have to take follow-up discussion on because there's methods for, if we're talking about automation, and remember that automation in large deployments too will go through gates and then use the gates to cache the installations as well. But typically the environment is chosen when you're installing it.
Yeah, I mean, I assume there is obviously a way to just override these parameters in the installation procedure, but I'm not that in the weeds. I probably need to just look at the documentation. Another
Yes,
question.
that's during the automation processes. Yep.
Yeah, and actually Reinhard, who is working for SAP, he just says it's easy possible, just add the various installation parameters. We're doing this on 19,000 hosts. So thanks Reinhard for that comment. So Ben, hopefully that answers your question. Another question from an onboarding perspective, how would you tackle the migration from AppMon agents to one agents from an onboarding perspective?
So there's a couple ways. Well, first of all, one agent will actually override the parameters of AppMon when it actually loads the agent. So that's been designed to automatically do that. If you're actually doing a migration, if you remember right on this planning sheet, we could source the number of hosts. One of the big things that we collect is all the different hosts and the things about those hosts that we want to actually load. That helps us give us size of the host, memory, everything else. Well, you can actually source that data from AppMon servers themselves, and then build yourself a planning, an immediate list to transform into the planning sheet. To say this is what we want to do. And what we do at that point is simply calculate out those hosts and do a sizing calculator as far as how much traffic that they'll generate and from which sites they're coming from, and then be able to plan out the active gates. Once you do that, you roll out the one agent. The one agent will actually override the Dynatrace parameters or AppMon parameters out of the gate. And then immediately start leveraging the one agent's use.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Right. Well, it's great to see that people are really keep asking questions, but please go on. I'm sure there's more coming.
Okay. So here's where when we talk about rolling out the different sheets for application onboarding by organization. And this just gives you an example of like where in a planning stage, we'll figure out all the lines of business, how many host units come in, and then we can start doing network calculations based off of host units is one of the calculations that we end up using on some of our sizing models. But this is the type of level of detail that we get into when we start looking at planning a very large deployment. Now, this is one style of rollout where we have a lot of information coming in about the hosts that we're going to be deploying out to. There's another method which is primarily where you just have groups of numbers of what the hosts are. So there's more of general pools done and there's less granularity to data. And they kind of get to onboard whenever they're ready. So there's various methods that are used in these large deployments on rolling out. There are forced pushed rollouts that come top down from executives, and then there's ones that are basically planned for scale and then allow the app teams to onboard knowing that with the sizing numbers that we did, that they're capable of onboarding when they're ready. And so that they'll have processes to onboard when that happens. I'm just coming through some of these because I want to get to certain areas. This is just going over some of the architectural diagrams that we provide where we actually will show, active gates in specific data centers, what type of active gates that we're actually using, whether or not these, and then the entire designs, I have some of the details blocked out here, but some of the designs that we use for building out the clusters, in this case being a 9-node cluster in a fault in a triple fault domain scenario. We've got many other scenarios that actually use separate availability zones on other cloud providers, and then we also have large-scale ones that are also on-prem. But this is the type of planning and detail that we have to get into so that we can constantly evolve a lot of the pieces to all the Dynatrace system features, everything from synthetics to session replays to how do you integrate Davis into the system, how do you move how do we get business insights and reports from the new synthetic network, and how do you roll out internal synthetic networks as well as plugins. So we talk about and we design and we always have ready these diagrams for these types of discussions, in order to really get down to the detail, because honestly, in a lot of these large deployments, the devil's always in the details.
There's just another quick question. I'm not sure if it fits right now, but with respect to licensing, is there an enterprise, an ELA, where we purchase an unlimited use? I'm not sure if you want to, just like throwing out the question to you in terms of an ELA.
Well, the most I could say is I know I've heard the term, thrown around. I've not actually seen any full ELAs myself, but I would leave that to probably more of the sales account execs.
Exactly, I think so too. So Jerry, if you want to reach out to your account rep at Dynatrace, then I'm sure he or she give you the answer. Another one just comes in from Reinhardt, who gave us the great answer earlier. He's just interested in if you're using the Dynatrace API itself for actually tracking the progress, so the numbers that you showed earlier in your Excel sheets.
Yes.
Are they coming from the Dynatrace API?
Yeah, we completely use all the APIs for that.
Awesome.
In fact, what we ended up doing was we took Power Query inside of Excel and we build the queries that go out and do all the topology API calls, and then it matches up the discovered host names with the planned host names. But not only do we do the tracking, and that's where it knows how many have been deployed versus the unplanned and planned, but we also allow it to wire up, and I didn't have time to go through all I could have demoed an entire sheet on how that works, but we also wire up to the self-monitoring environment. So we've developed standards in the self-monitoring environment so that we can track all of the planned assets that we plan to put out in the cluster, because in some of these cases I see 128 gates, and you've got 45 different cluster nodes covering 3 different major environments. That's a lot of assets to cover, and what we end up doing is we actually then begin tracking our actuals versus our estimates on capacity through this sheet. So the answer is yes, we do it in 2 pieces, both tracking the full deployments themselves across all environments that are being deployed to, and we also track planned Dynatrace assets versus their actual deployments using the self-monitoring environment.
Perfect. Thank you. Cool. Just to give you a little time check, we have about 10 minutes.
Yep. So let me get back to just some of the other examples of with a lot of the solutions that are already available by Dynatrace or upcoming features. We work closely with the product management team, and we've solutioned various things. But one of the big ones that we do is, and it gets asked a lot about, is a system or a product, I shouldn't say a product, but I should say a major tool called the Streaming API, which is essentially a visual interface for building metric export jobs, which will allow you to, it allows you to connect the API and pick whatever metrics that you want to export out. Let's say you want to send it to a file, Q or Kafka. Then you can set up these jobs that will essentially call whatever API you want and grab whatever metrics you tell it to grab, and then put it on a shipped on a regular basis. There's some tactics used inside of large-scale environments for very large deployments. One thing I want to mention is that planning sheet actually has all the formulas for setting up the proper metadata, not only for the self-monitoring environments, but one of the keys to actually deploying in large environments as a best practice is to make sure that your metadata payloads that you send out to the hosts contain Things like the organization the host belongs to, the application it may service, and then we have a whole entire detailed set of best practice metadata that we recommend, and then you would actually fill that into this sheet. And then that sheet will then help drive your automation scripts to ensure that you send out enough metadata to each host, allowing you to build automated tagging rules. Which is really the best practice in Dynatrace, is to essentially get the proper metadata out there, and then that will then eventually drive all of your management zones, who can access what, your services, and so on.
Brett, if you say that, because it means from your Excel sheet, I think we need to call it something else than Excel sheet, because it's feeling like a powerful.
It's called the Enterprise Rollout Sheet, actually.
Yeah, the Enterprise Rollout Sheet. So that means you're actually generating the host config property files where all the tags are in there, or you're creating the API calls so that people can just execute these API calls to push the metadata to Dynatrace.
Yep. Yeah. Actually, you can either do it that way or DT custom props exports.
Cool.
You can, so you can do it that way. But the formula actually can be built there, and then we actually have the sheets that talk about what are the top things that you should put in that metadata. And then that all then drives your alert profiles, your management zones, your tagging rules, and everything else.
Pretty cool.
And the other thing I was going to mention here is there is one other methods where in more of a forced push out, where organizations want to have a mass blast where they can get visibility onto the machines quicker. There is a method where they roll out in full stack only. And that allows them to at least get their eyes on the machine without even introducing full stack capabilities. That also gets them all kinds of information about the actuals of the system sizes, the memory, and everything else. And then you'll see them plan automations where they'll then sweep pass through at another date and now activate full stack on the lower environments. And this is where there's major initiatives to just get full adoption out at more of a top-down approach versus an app onboard approach. Other than that, I think I've covered like a lot of the major things that we do when we do these deployments. There's a lot more to it. That I can even cover in a single hour, but hopefully I gave folks enough information as far as what we consider, the sizes, how we do some of the planning, how we do some of the onboarding, and then what our team does to ensure best practices are kept, and we can also track the rollout progress.
Very cool. So Brett, there's a couple of more things, questions and feedback that just came in. I want to throw this over to you. Before I do that, what's the best way for people to get in touch with your team?
They can actually just contact me. I think you have it on the top of the board there, or on the front web page. It's brett.hofer@dynatrace.com.
Perfect. And then get in touch with you.
Yep, and either that, or if you want to also talk with or inquire about it with, if you already have a delivery services manager or your account manager.
And then basically ask for the Enterprise Solution Architect team. Yeah.
Correct.
Exactly. Cool. So then the first thing I want to do is I want to get in contact with Reinhard. As I mentioned earlier, he's working for SAP and has been rolling out, as we heard earlier, thousands of agents. And he's also built a lot of automation using our API, and he would like to exchange some thoughts and practices with you.
Yep.
And that's one thing. The next question is there a way to control the amount of agents that connect? So for instance, in Admon, so this is an Admon from Admon user, admins are able to set the maximum number of agents that are able to connect with an agent group assignment. Is something similar available on the Dynatrace side to kind of control the rollout of one agent for certain Dynatrace environments?
Yeah, you mean like a quota on the environments. I'm not sure if they've introduced a specific feature yet, but I do know that we had a solution one, which basically whenever we saw folks go past what we wanted them to, their team would actually get uninstrumented, which is just basically a monitor off.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I have to confirm, Andy, whether or not they were putting any more granular level, because this was on a specific environment. They needed to control even within the environment how many agents from specific application areas they wanted to allow.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So.
Another feedback and kind of observation. So it seems that your team is obviously doing a lot more than just installing Dynatrace and rolling it out, because I think earlier you showed the work that goes into the planning, where you look at the architecture and you talked about DevOps. So the question here is, are you also helping and giving advice on how they should restructure their processes, how they can become more CI/CD enabled? This is also what your team is providing?
So we do, yes, and let me preface it this way. Yes, it's an annual contract with our team, so there's an upfront, and that's where I was showing either a new or existing customer, enterprise customer. If it's a new one doing a full-blown managed install, we spent a lot of our time upfront on obviously putting everything into place. As far as, and then the best practices and all the assets that I went over in the planning sheet that I went over. Then what will happen is, as far as DevOps and CI/CD is concerned, is that's typically we'll look at a single application and we will give guidance, limited guidance to those app teams, because obviously when you have a one-year contract, there's only so many hours in a week that you're allocated, and so we will provide guidance and some of the best practices, but as it gets more and more in-depth, typically it may take a different, like a longer engagement that is specific to just that, depending on the complexity of what they're trying to do on the CI/CD.
I think we also have an offering that I believe we announced recently at Perform, which we call ACM, Autonomous Cloud Management, where
Correct.
we are offering, and also some of our partners are helping customers to really change the way they deliver and operate software, really changing also the processes and the tool integration, all that. Reinhard is again helping here with a comment. Coming back to Corey's question, there is a tenant license quota API where you can specify the max agents property. That means you can actually limit the number of agents that can connect to a single environment. And I would assume, Corey, if new agents come in and the quota is already maxed out, that means the new agents will basically not get instrumented anymore, and I'm sure there will be
warning. Right, but that's at the environment. What I find though in our scenarios is it's more granular than that, because they want a lot of the apps in the same environment, but they don't want all those apps. They want almost the app level quota.
Yeah. Okay. All right, I'm pretty sure there could be a longer discussion from here on. There's a lot of interest in this stuff, and obviously it's very important, especially for large enterprises, to do this right. I would still say because we're at the top of the hour, I see some people are now dropping off. Brett, thank you so much. Very insightful and very interesting to learn what your team is doing, and people now know how they can reach out to you and your team. So brett.hofer@dynatrace.com, or ask your Dynatrace representatives to get in touch with the ESA team, the Enterprise Solutions Architect team. The session has been recorded. The slides, we will also make them available on the Dynatrace University. And if there is follow-up questions, reach out to him. Also use answers.dynatrace.com. That's always a great way too. And I know that Reinhard is also actively on there, so he's also answering questions there. He's very knowledgeable on how we use and the API can be used. And Brett, I would be very happy to invite you back at a later point to go into more specific topics if the feedback is there.
Sure.
That want to drill deeper.
Well, thank you for having me, Annie.
Yeah, all right.